And welcome to First Strike right here on VSiN. I'm your host, Dave Ross. For the next hour, we're going to break down everything from a betting standpoint here from UFC London. And it should be a wild atmosphere across the big pond tomorrow morning. Everybody here in the United States, get those wagers in early because it's going to start a little bit earlier than you're used to here back in the United States. We're going to have Lou Finocchiaro standing by here momentarily. Jordan Sherwood is going to join us from Chicago. Kevin Iole will be back in the program. And Reed Kuhn is going to join us from Washington, D.C. to round out this hour. But let's begin with the aforementioned Lou Finocchiaro, the host of the About Business podcast. Follow him on Twitter, as I do, at GamLou. And Lou, I love these cards, right? Just from a fan's perspective, the atmosphere is going to be crazy. We saw what it was like not that long ago over there. I expect more of the same tomorrow back over in jolly old England. When you look at the main event here, and Tom Aspinall, look, they've got a lot of favorites over there in Europe that they're going to see in this card. So they're going to be having a rooting interest in a lot of these fights. Maybe none bigger than the main event with Aspinall, still the undefeated young heavyweight. And Curtis Blaydes here, the American that comes in, and he will be persona non grata in this main event. Does the atmosphere, does that play into the handicap at all? Because we always say, hey, at the end of the day, those fans can't fight for the fighter.
Well, that's a great question. I first want to say thanks for having me on, Dave. Weekly, I watch this show, and to be on with Jordan and Kevin and Reed is great, and you do a great job rounding us all out. To answer your question, it does and it doesn't. To me, the biggest thing that I take, and I did it in the last London card in March, it didn't work well, was that I felt that there was a little bit of baked in number towards the locals. And in March, the locals all rolled. Now that momentum rolls into this fight card, and there's more momentum into some of the locals. And I still feel there's even more opportunity baked into the local line. Therefore, in many cases, I'm looking against the local. Will it work? I don't know, but I sense value there, and so that's where I'm going.
Yeah, and you do a great job of finding the value, and certainly when you watch some of these weigh-ins, you can glean something from that. When you look at this fight here in the main event, again, Aspinall is the younger guy. He said on record, before he knew this fight was going to be made, that Curtis Blaydes might be a bad matchup for him. He loves Curtis Blaydes. It's one of his favorite fighters to watch in the UFC. And you know Curtis's history very well, and normally he's susceptible, who isn't, to maybe big punchers, like we've seen with Derek Lewis in a fight he was winning early, and then, of course, got knocked out from the uppercut from hell. So is it as simple for Curtis to block out the noise of the crowd, figure out a way to drag this fight down to the ground, and maybe utilize his wrestling, which Aspinall is on record as saying could give him problems?
I think he has to use his dominance, and I think his dominance is his ability on the floor, most especially against a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt from top position. And we're going to learn, I'd like to think we'll learn a lot about what kind of black belt Aspinall really does have. He's a big kid, even though Blaydes is the thicker, heavier kid. Aspinall is a little bit taller. And Aspinall's power comes with quickness and footwork, which he will have over Blaydes. So there's plenty of cat and mouse here. To me, what really means a lot is that this line broke with Curtis Blaydes minus 120 or thereabouts, and Aspinall even. And the bookmakers knew then that this was London. They knew then that there was going to be some momentum on the newbie heavyweight phenom, or at least that's where the public likes to go, with new fangled, new playtime heavyweight talent. I think Blaydes is getting a little bit overlooked. I think his wrestling chops, his experience in 5-round fights and such is really good. I just wish Aspinall was more of an ass like Paddy was, so I could talk ill of him. But he's very respectful. He has a great system and a great respect for other fighters and his history, and he's a great guy to like. That said, I think Blaydes is more focused, has more to lose. Aspinall is still coming up. I think this is a PhD in MMA for Aspinall. but I'm a minority thinking that, I believe.
You referenced Paddy Pimblett, who has taken certainly this card by storm in many different ways. We'll get to him in a bit, but I do want to look at the total, because if we feel like the side is relatively tough to figure out here, and that's why, yes, the betting market now is favoring Aspinall here, but you can see why that flip of favorite is still a relatively small favorite, even for Aspinall now minus $1.40. I look at that 3.5 at plus money here at DraftKings, plus $1.50. You mentioned an education. That education, we believe, by Blaydes would come on the ground. Is it enough that you think this goes into championship rounds and Aspinall gets pushed into waters he's not accustomed to?
That's how I am envisioning this fight, Dave. Yes. That said, the bookmakers and the market are envisioning Aspinall, and they're envisioning Aspinall quicker, under the 3.5. And so I get that. I just don't see it like the market does.
Yeah, that's going to be the interesting style here. Does Aspinall come out quickly like he did last time they were here in London, get it done in the first round? Or is it going to be more of a patient fighter? And this is a fighter he truly respects by his comments. I'm with you. I think there's going to be more of a feeling out process in that first round. And maybe Aspinall shows a little bit of caution knowing the guy he's going up against.
And excuse me for interrupting, Dave, but Aspinall's not seen the third round in his professional career.
Right.
It must be the goal of Blaydes and the Blaydes camp, team elevation, with conditioning, cardio, and wrestling to drag him to hell.
Yeah, if that's your advantage, right? And the team elevation, that's why you train there. You would think that's exactly what Curtis Blaydes wants to do. Of course, resides out of Chicago, but with team elevation, you're expecting that cardio to go deep into that London evening. You look up and down this card, Lou, and it's fascinating because this is what the UFC does, and I think they do a great job of it. You're going to get a lot of European flavor in a lot of these fights here, and it almost feels like you can pit the United States as the enemy, the bad guy, if you will, in some of these fans. The Joker's back here with Jack Hermansson taking on Chris Curtis here. Relatively close fight, at least on paper. How do you see this one?
I see this as a really excellent competitive fight, and the matchmaking's really well done. You got a guy in Curtis that's kind of a bully, and Curtis fought at 170 his whole career until November of last year, where he accepted a UFC fight up a weight class at 85. This fight tomorrow night will be his fourth fight in 8 months. That's a heavy, heavy pace for a guy that's fighting up a weight class, stepping up in class each way along the way. Now he travels across the pond to fight Hermansson in his own backyard. I know that Hermansson doesn't like to get bullied, and really Curtis is a bully. So that's what he's going to try and do. But Hermansson's a legit top 5 talent. He's good on the ground. He's also good on the feet. I think he's going to be too well-rounded for Chris Curtis. And I'm more than happy to take Hermansson at a plus 100, minus 110 kind of a price, really close to pick him. I think this fight could end up being very similar to the Fiallo-Jake Matthews fight a few months ago, when Fiallo was taking fight after fight after fight. You can't do that to your body at this level.
Yeah, great point. And again, when you look at the possible ways of victory, it kind of tells you in the numbers how this fight's going to play out. Because you look at Curtis, it looks like KO, TK, or DQ, plus just over $2, about plus 220. Sub, it's the absolute long shot. Decision, plus 320. Then look at the Joker, plus 550 at KO, TK, or DQ, plus 550 submission. All right, and then a decision at plus 280. So they're telling you the Joker is more well-rounded than what you're going to get from Chris Curtis on Fight Night on Saturday night. In the couple minutes that we have, you mentioned Paddy Pimblett, Paddy the Batty. He's up to his antics again. This is a newcomer in the UFC. He's got a lot of consternation, I think, one way or the other. We know that he and Jordan Leavitt right now, they have had some bad words to say about each other that clearly each wants to stop the other guy. How do you see this playing out? And really, I'm expecting this number to go up, but still under $3 for Paddy Pimblett at minus 275.
Yes, and so it's interesting that the number hasn't gone up. I released Jordan Leavitt a week ago plus 215, so that's only 15 cents. So there is some Leavitt money. Leavitt's the more well-rounded fighter. He's got no power whatsoever, but I do believe that he poses a threat to Paddy, provided he can get this thing out of the first round. Paddy's the bigger guy, got more power. If he gets Leavitt down and gets on top, he could pose a real problem. Not only do I like Leavitt for just a small little position here, I also think this fight goes to a decision because, in a sense, betting that this fight goes all the way to a decision, oh, by the way, plus 220, is it also a bet for Leavitt that he's durable and can make it through 15 minutes of fight time?
Yeah, and again, you can get plus $5 if you think Leavitt can get this fight done via decision. You can understand the power or the lack thereof. That's why KO, TKO, or DQ for the underdog is 13-1. So really, you figure it's either going to be by decision for Leavitt as the underdog or by submission at 6-1. And if he can get this done, we'll see how this goes for Paddy the Baddy. A lot of pressure when you're fighting in your hometown, or certainly in your home country. Let's see how this plays out for Paddy Pimblett. Very quickly before we go here, there's so many different fights on this card here, where you do have a European pitted against an American. You still want to go with that idea of maybe those inflated prices with the Euros. This is the time to go the other way in some of these fights on the undercard?
I feel that way, and Exhibit A is Molly Meatball McCann, who opens minus 225. Now she's minus 4 something.
Wow.
Be patient and wait. Goldy by decision is now plus 650. Why wouldn't you? Chances are she's not going to win it, but why wouldn't you?
Very quickly, the Bout Business podcast, Lou. You're going to give them another great listen this week, correct?
You bet. 16 minutes of final releases. It's out now, available anywhere you get your podcast. Thanks so much, Dave, and good luck to everybody.
Great to have Lou on the show each and every week. Lou Finocchiaro, follow him on Twitter @GamLou. When we come back, Jordan Sherwood is going to check in from Chicago on this European fight card. Come on back. It's VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. DraftKings Sportsbook is giving you plenty of ways to bet the UFC. Just download the DraftKings Sportsbook app, and you're going to be able to bet on more ways than just the main event. DraftKings has great odds on fight lines and total rounds and futures of all MMA events. Eligibility restrictions to apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for the full terms and conditions. We continue on First Strike right here on VSiN. Always a pleasure to go to the south side of Chicago. He's going to go take in a White Sox game tonight. He is Jordan Sherwood. You can follow him on Twitter @Woodon1063. Jordan, I was told by our producer, Britton Haas, that Chicago is technically the Europe of the Midwest. Is there any truth to that?
I'll take his word for it. I mean, look, Chicago's got great food. It's got great sports fans. It has plenty of, attractions for tourists, kind of similar weather, I guess. So, yeah. Why not? Let's go with that.
Let's be honest. From living in Chicago, it's better food in Chicago than Europe. Sorry. And let's talk about your unnamed MMA podcast here, Jordan, because you had a relatively big name on who celebrated in style after joining you in the pod.
Yeah, we were excited to have Dustin Jacoby on the Unnamed MMA podcast. I mean, only because we cashed on him as an underdog. But the better story was how he celebrated apparently a golf trip to the Lake of the Ozarks with him and a bunch of buddies. So cool to hear that. Cool to hear that he might actually get the winner of Volkan Oezdemir, Paul Craig, in his next fight at UFC 280. So we'll pay attention to that. But nonetheless, always good to talk to a guy, especially one that filled our pockets with cash following his win last Saturday.
That's fantastic. And yes, go out and celebrate fighters after all the work you put in to get that upset victory as he got last week. Let's stay right there where you mentioned with Paul Craig against Volkan Oezdemir. This is a very intriguing fight. Craig right now is the underdog. But you actually, instead of liking the side, you might like the total in this one. What do you see with no time against Paul Craig?
Yeah, I mean, I do see two guys that are finishers. And albeit, Volkan Oezdemir lately has gone to the judges' scorecards. It's more leaning on really the game plan that Paul Craig's going to try and institute. He's looked impressive. Obviously, his last two times in the octagon, both times he cashed as an underdog against Nikita Krylov and Jamal Hill. Both of them, finishes inside the distance. And I think we're going to get a similar game plan. Paul Craig's not going to want to mess around on the feet. And if he gets it to the ground, he's going to have a decisive advantage over Volkan Oezdemir. But Volkan Oezdemir still is probably the best striker overall from a variety standpoint that Paul Craig has been in there with. And Paul Craig, at times, has fallen in love with his hands. So I'm going to just bank on the fact that either Paul Craig's going to get this fight to the ground and do what he's been doing lately, and that's get a quick submission, or he's going to trust his hands long enough for it to hurt him, and Volkan Oezdemir is going to get a finish, whether it be on the feet or via TKO. Look, it's juiced a little bit to the over, certainly, but I still like it. I think we're going to get a fight inside the distance. One of them is getting their hand raised before the judges' scorecards. Yeah,
no question, Jordan. And the other thing about Oezdemir, for those who might forget, he fell on some hard times outside of the octagon that have nothing to do with fighting. When he was making that ascent, got all the way to a title shot against Daniel Cormier not that long ago. He's only 32, is the younger fighter in this one. Is that why you would lean, though, on the side towards no time in this one to get his hand raised?
I do. I just think that, look, Paul Craig's falling in love with his hands. This is the best striker in Volkan Oezdemir. Volkan Oezdemir has been in there with the best. He actually, had the current champion kind of in trouble, in his UFC debut, Yuri Prochazka, and then ended up getting knocked out in that fight in that second round. And you're right, 32 years of age. He's still relatively young in the sport. He's now, I believe, training with Khamzat Chimaev and Alexander Gustafsson, so we know what those killers can do. And I like his chances against the Bear Jew. Typically, I cash in on the Bear Jew. I'm not going with it. I do like Oezdemir, but I'll play it safe and also go on the under at 2.5.
Yeah, fantastic nickname for Paul Craig. And I'll tell you this, too. If you back Craig, it always feels like he's behind. And they always feel like come-from-behind victories. So can he pull that rabbit out of the hat a third time in a row here against Oezdemir? It might be a tall order. Speaking of legends in the sport, and one of the best fights I've ever seen was for the light heavyweight championship. And I can't believe it's almost a decade ago now. John Jones, of course, when he was the champion against Alexander Gustafsson. Gus is back, and it's been a minute here to see him. And he's a dog in this one, plus $1.65 here against Nikita Krylov. What do you make of Gus coming back? Still motivated? Because we know the skill set, when he is motivated and is in shape, it's one of the best that we've seen.
Yeah, well, I'm happy that he went back to 205 and didn't try again his hand at heavyweight. We saw how lethargic he looked against Fabricio Verdum 2 years ago. He looked good on the scale. And look, if Alexander Gustafsson is right and he's motivated, he's at the right camp. He looked good. And he's facing a guy in Nikita Krylov who is immensely talented. But I talked about this the last time when we were talking about the Paul Craig and the Krylov fight. And I said to you, Krylov makes dumb decisions in the cage all the time. And I said to you, he's going to make another one. He's going to go to the ground with Paul Craig. So how can you trust him anytime? And let alone he's the favorite. Alexander Gustafsson, if he's right, he is better everywhere than Nikita Krylov. Better wrestler, better striker. Obviously, got better cardio. So I think absolutely Alexander Gustafsson, because he looked good in the scale, believing that he's actually motivated at 205 is the right play, especially as an underdog. I'll take the risk on Gustafsson, believing that he's going to come back and look like somewhat of the Gustafsson of old, and that's good enough for me to beat Krylov.
Well, and that's, I think, why it's important to look at some of those weigh-ins, because I think you can glean right there, Jordan, because you're right. I mean, you nailed it. If this is, the normal Alexander Gustafsson, it really wouldn't be this competitive. And yet to get that plus price tag here with Gus, if he looks good in the scale, that means he worked hard to make that weight easily for him. So I'm with you on this one. I think we got a live dog here in Alexander Gustafsson, so close to winning that historic fight that we saw back in Sweden almost a decade ago. You have a take on Makwan Amirkhani against Jonathan Pierce, which is a very interesting take. What do you see in Amirkhani that thinks that maybe this is going to be a quick night of work for him?
I do. Look, Makwan Amirkhani, what do we know about him? Quick starter, fades late. Yes. He gets out of the gates early. We saw him at his UFC debut, a flying knee knockout of Andy Ogle. Last time out, he was better than Grundy, got one of those sick anaconda chokes. And what do we know about Jonathan Pierce? Notorious slow starter. And granted, we'll go back to his UFC debut when he was just overwhelmed by Joe Lozon in Boston. I quite frankly could think the same thing could happen. I mean, I do think Pierce is talented. He's a big featherweight. He's got good skill set wrestling and boxing. But I think Amirkhani out of the gates, and especially, utilizing his athleticism, his takedowns, and those chokes, I like Makwan Amirkhani not only to win the fight as the dog, but in round one. Woo. And I think you can get it at plus 650. I grabbed it at FanDuel earlier on. So why not? I mean, Makwan probably would fade late, so maybe if you don't get it, you bet it live and you go with Pierce. But I like Makwan Amirkhani to come out of the gates hot like he does, and overwhelm Jonathan Pierce in a fantastic first-round finish.
Excellent handicap, because you're right. He's going to come out like a house of fire here. So if Amir Khan gets it done, you would think it would be in round one. And then what does he have left if it gets past round one? That's where live betting certainly comes into play there. I talked a little bit about this with Lou Finocchiaro to begin the show here. When you're fighting over here, it's going to be a wild atmosphere. Like, I really enjoyed, from a fan's perspective, watching the first one that they had at UFC London. So we know it's going to be crazy. Molly McCann, she's going to be out there, and we know that Paddy Pimblett's going to be fighting later. They're kind of like joined at the hip, these two. McCann kind of gets it started, then Pimblett finishes it late. Is there any pressure on Molly McCann here in a fight now that she is ballooned up to almost a $4.50 favorite in this fight?
I don't think either one of them is going to feel pressure. I think both of them are going to feed off of the hometown crowd. Both of them have relatively favorable matchups. Certainly Molly McCann does against Hannah Goldy, who's really not better anywhere than Molly McCann. And quite frankly, listen, no disrespect to Molly, I just don't think she's that good of a fighter. But this is another spoon-fed fight for her. But I think a lot of people may be a little bit naive to the fact that she's really not a finisher. Yeah, she had an impressive finish against Carolina her last time out, but I don't see that happening. Hannah Goldy in 8 fights, tough to put away, just strong physically. So get that down from $4.50 to $1.35, $1.30. Molly McCann via decision, I think, is the rightful play in that fight. But I don't think Molly McCann's going to be intimidated or overwhelmed by the amounts of pressure. She's adored. If she loses the fight, she's still going to be loved and adored by her hometown crowd, but she just won't be probably as favorable in the UFC's eyes moving forward.
Yeah, talk about nicknames. Meatball's as good as they come right there from Molly McCann. That's for sure. Got about a minute to go here. I do want to get to the main event. And it is interesting when you look at how this line is switched here from Blaydes being the favorite. Now, a sizable dog here, Tom Aspinall, he feels like the next big thing, certainly in the heavyweight division. You actually think this fight might be a quick fight? How do you see it going down?
Yeah, I mean, quicker, I think, than most people think. Because I think a lot of people are siding with Blaydes. They're surprised that he's at an underdog. Grab him at plus money, first time in his UFC career, and he's got the wrestling to do it. But I still think Aspinall is special. I think there's something that this guy is going to be fighting, probably even a champion at some point. So I think he touches the chin of Curtis Blaydes, or we see Blaydes' takedown and his unbelievable top game come to effect. So I'm grabbing the under at 2.5. I'm not sure what side I want to lean yet. So I'm just going to play it. I do believe we get a finish. We're not going to go into deeper waters. Aspinall can't handle that. Blaydes is going to try and get him out of there early. So I think the under at 2.5 is the play.
Yeah, and with that crowd, that being the final fight at UFC London, it's going to be live. Jordan, enjoy the White Sox game tonight, my friend, back there at the Europe, Chicago, the Europe of the Midwest, as we call it now. Hey, Jordan, appreciate you as always. Come on back. Kevin Iole next, right here. First Strike on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. Want more betting insights to give you an edge? Well, check out VSiN's Best Bets podcast. You can listen to daily sports betting highlights from the entire 24/7 stream of VSiN experts tracking line moves, odds, props, wins, losses, bad beats from sportsbooks in Vegas and across the entire country. So download the VSiN Best Bets podcast now at VSiN.com/podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, we roll on here on First Strike on VSiN, and what a pleasure it is to have Kevin Iole rejoin the program again this week. Follow him on Twitter as I do, at Kevin I. And if you are, like I am, immersed on these fights, watching them maybe at home, you see Kevin always up there because he's a well-respected voice, certainly when it comes to judging and the way you see these fights. So I can't wait, Kevin, to pick your brain about this card over there in UFC London. We were talking before we began the segment about Paddy Pimblett, and he is such a lightning rod, if you will, right now in the sport for a guy who hasn't been there very long. So you look at the number here, minus 275 against Jordan Leavitt. These two guys have not been cordial to each other leading up to this fight week, right? So we're expecting this to be explosive one way or the other. How do you handicap this fight? And could Pimblett be a little bit better than what we think we've seen so far in his young UFC career?
To be honest with you, I would say I think he's a little worse than we've seen so far in his UFC career. I mean, he's 2-0 in the UFC with 2 first-round finishes. So if you look at that, you go, hey, this guy's doing pretty good, right? And he's almost a 3-1 favorite against Jordan Leavitt. But, I think Pimblett has been matched very well, right? They've looked and they said, hey, this is a guy that can sell tickets. This is a guy that, maybe can sell pay-per-views. And eventually he's going to have to fight, the big boys. But they're trying to build him a name. And the UFC doesn't do this often, right? So when you look at a guy like this, that they have hope that he can sell. But I just look at Pimblett and I go, I think he has holes in his game. And I just think this is an overlay here. I mean, you're talking, almost 3-1 on Pimblett. And I think Jordan Leavitt is a solid fighter. I don't think he is great by any shakes of the imagination, but a very solid fighter, with no one outstanding hole in his game. So I just say, hey, I'm going to take Leavitt in this one. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was plus 215 when I saw it.
Yeah.
So, I like Leavitt here in this spot. I mean, it's hard to pass that up when I don't think highly of the opponent.
Yeah, and it's going that way. Leavitt now up to a plus 230. When you look at this here for the pathways to victory, which I always think is intriguing from a betting perspective here, Kevin, because you look at Leavitt and it shows you he doesn't have hands. 13-1 to get a KO, TK, or DQ. Sub, that's where he's a little bit more proficient here. 6-1 if you think he can pull off the upset that way, or if he can ride out a decision. 5-1 there. But look at Paddy Pimblett, because I think for those, Kevin, that haven't seen him like you have in the first two, they go, well, who is he? Is he a striker? Is he a submission guy? He has said publicly this week he wants to throw hands with Leavitt because he doesn't think that Leavitt can throw hands. Would that be the pathway for Paddy if you didn't want to lay the big number? You say, okay, he's going to get out the non-striker at plus 220. Is that a plausible scenario for Pimblett?
Yeah, I think, if you're expecting Pimblett to win, you look at it, you say he's going to probably win by a knockout. there's not going to be a submission by Paddy Pimblett on Jordan Leavitt. I don't think there's any chance of that happening. Unless, hey, he hurts him with a punch and maybe puts a rear naked choke on it. But he's actually going to submit him, via grappling. I don't think is likely, but Pimblett is, I think his forte is throwing hands on the feet, more of a kickboxer. He's confident. He's going to have a hometown crowd that's going to roar every single move he does. And I think that forces guys sometimes into stand-up fights. And in this case, he's fighting a guy that doesn't have a lot of power coming back at him, right? So you're not expecting Leavitt to hurt him. So I think if I'm looking for a way to back Pimblett, it's going to be Pimblett by a finish, specifically a knockout.
There it is. And that's why I'm kind of thinking you're picking up what I'm putting down there. Maybe if you wanted to play both sides, you play Pimblett at plus 220 to get the KO, or Leavitt to pull the upset at plus 230. If at least one of those two things happen, you can lock in a little bit of profit. Kevin, I do not care what people do in their personal relationships. I don't know if Molly McCann and Paddy Pimblett are just good friends joined at the hip. I have no idea. But they clearly feed off each other in the fight game, and Molly would probably be the first one inside the octagon if Paddy were to get a victory. What about her stance here? Because the number is just blown up as this week's gone for Meatball here. She is now a 450 betting favorite against Hannah Goldy. Any danger here that there's too much expectation now on a fight that she is clearly heavily favored to win?
Yeah, I don't think she deserves to be that big of a favorite. But hey, when I look at Hannah Goldy, I just think this is a bottom level UFC fighter, right? So she's barely hanging on to her job, right? I think if she had lost her last fight, she was gone, and it was a close fight. I think Hannah is one of those fighters that when you're trying to build somebody and you want them to look good, you match them with Hannah Goldy. And I don't think Molly is any great shake. I know in the last fight in London, they had a sellout crowd. It set a record gate for a UFC Fight Night, and they were crazy about 3 fighters on that card: Pimblett, Aspinall, and Molly McCann. And I think Molly's got a lot of holes, and there are a lot of girls that are going to take advantage of it. But when I look at this fight, I just say I just don't see how Hannah Goldy's going to win the fight. There's no way that I can conceive of that I say, okay, Hannah Goldy might be able to do this. I just think it's a rough go for her, and I think she'll probably get finished somewhere in this fight. Okay, so maybe you can get that inside the decision for Molly McCann, and then you don't have to lay that big price tag of minus 450. Kevin, I look at some of these fights, and certainly the main event is the one that comes top of the mind here, where they're just really intriguing matchups stylistically, right? Curtis Blaydes taking on Tom Aspinall.
Aspinall clearly is more well-rounded. Now, Curtis has gotten better with his hands as his UFC career has progressed, but that's what we don't think necessarily he wants to fall in love with in this heavyweight matchup. One, how does Curtis block out the noise of fighting before a partisan crowd? And two, is the only pathway for now what would be an upset victory for Curtis, does it have to be with that great wrestling skill that he brings to the octagon?
You know, when I talked to Curtis at length about the crowd, and the one thing that I am confident in, that I'm thinking 100% certain, is that Curtis isn't going to be affected by the crowd. You know, there's some fighters that get intimidated or whatever. Curtis in front of Dana White, wrestled a boring wrestling heavy style with few chances when Dana White was sitting a few feet away, and he knew that Dana didn't want that style, and he did it anyways, and he put his job at risk, right? Because that was a big fight. And Dana wasn't happy. Curtis is a guy, his own man, so he's going to do what he thinks he needs to do to win the fight. The reason I like Aspinall in the fight, though, and here's where it comes. Aspinall is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but he's also got great hands. So where does Curtis go? Curtis, if he decides to strike with him, I think Tom is more athletic. He can create angles, and I think he's going to be able to land some things. I don't see this one going to a finish, even though Blaydes insisted to me, hey, this is going to be a finish because heavyweight fights of this caliber don't go to decision. I think this is going to be the one that does. But I think the winner of this fight is going to be Tom Aspinall, and I think it probably is going to wind up being a stand-up battle. And I think as the fight goes on, it's going to be more and more in Aspinall's favor. I wouldn't be surprised in the second half of the fight if you see Blaydes really work the submission game a lot and try to kind of come from behind by looking to get a submission. But you're fighting a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt who is getting better every time. And I think we're going to see a really big performance by Tom Aspinall. To me, Aspinall is one of those guys, and I think he sits there with Cyril Gahn, who has just unbelievable talent, and we haven't seen anything yet. And he's one of these days he's going to explode, and you're going to say, "Holy crap, this guy is really amazing." So I like Aspinall to win this fight. I also like it to go all 5 rounds.
That is a fascinating handicap. Plus $2, by the way, if this fight is to go to the decision. I'm with you. I see this fight going a little bit deeper into the British night, if you will. So I'm going to play both the 2.5, 3.5, and maybe even nibble now at that plus $2 for the fight to go to the decision. Another interesting matchup. It wasn't that long ago that Volkan Oezdemir, no time, was on that fast ascent in the light heavyweight division. Of course, got stopped by Daniel Cormier back in the day. Had some, I'd say, tumultuous issues outside of the octagon, which has kind of stunted his growth here. What do you make of this matchup against Paul Craig, who, by his own account, always seems to fall behind and get these ridiculous stoppage finishes?
Yeah, I think, I don't know that, the outside of the cage issues felled Oezdemir. I think, look who he's been fighting. I mean, he's been fighting really elite guys. Dominic Reyes after DC. I mean, and the one advantage that you have to give Oezdemir is he has fought everybody, right? Alexander Rakic and Ankalaev. I mean, he's had the who's who of that division in there. He fought Yuri Prohaska. So he has fought everybody, and that's the one advantage he has. Now, what has happened? He's lost most of those fights, right? You have to worry, but this is one of those fights where I think, it's going to either probably end up as a knockout by Oezdemir or a submission by Paul Craig. To me, I see that happening. If Paul Craig starts slow and gets hurt, Oezdemir can knock anybody out, including DC, right? He has that kind of power to put anybody.
No question about it. Kevin, I cannot wait for that matchup as well. It should be a really good one between Paul Craig and Volkan Oezdemir. Kevin, appreciate the time and the information as always. When we come back, we're going to go to D.C. Reed Kuhn joins us next on First Strike on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. We continue First Strike right here on VSiN, and what a pleasure to welcome back Reed Kuhn to the program. Reed, we can't have you on for every fight card. You have other responsibilities, but it's good to have you back. Our viewing public certainly missed you last weekend. But look, you look at this card over here at UFC London, and we've been talking about it with our handicappers here throughout the hour. And obviously, the crowd does have to play into a little bit of the handicapping here. But for your numbers, for the data, is there any way to incorporate that into home cooking, if you will, for any of these fighters? Because we know there's such a European feel to this fight card.
Honestly, I think the biggest issue is going to be in the main event, because we have a situation where we have a wrestler versus a clearly superior striker. Blaydes is going to want to get this to the ground. He's going to be avoiding submissions. He wants to wrestle. But a 5-round fight with Blaydes on top, the crowd is going to go nuts. Mm-hmm. They are going to give that referee 20,000 reasons to stand this thing up. And that is a concern here. No, that is not in the numbers. But I got to read this the way it is. I'm going to stick with the math. It's done right by me. So I am leaning towards that wrestler. I like to back dominant wrestlers, especially Blaydes, who has been in against fierce strikers before. He knows how to stay out of danger, close the distance, and then turn it into his game, which is on the mat. So yeah, I'm going to be sitting there sweating for 25 minutes maybe, because I'm going to hear all those boos. The referee is going to be, hearing it as well. And I hope we don't see some premature stand-ups.
You're right, because Reed, I think that is something that certainly when you're breaking down this fight, you have to take that into account. And I think that's the best way you can do it with the numbers, knowing that Blaydes is going to want to get this fight down to the ground. But does the referee say, all right, I hear the thousands and thousands, let me stand this thing back up? Also for Aspinall, do you have enough data for him still being a relatively young heavyweight? Because clearly you have enough volume to figure out what you think Blaydes is going to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a sample size 10x difference. So Curtis Blaydes, 154 octagon minutes. Tom Aspinall, only 15. That is a big difference. So yeah, when I see those stats, they look freakishly good. His striking stats look amazing. He hasn't been taken down, but he's only faced 2 takedowns. So sample size is important here. I'm trying to gauge that. Now, just strictly the styles here makes enough of a difference, and Blaydes has earned those metrics against elite talent, whereas Aspinall kind of rolled through a few quick knockouts, and that's going to skew your statistics. And we've seen that before with Khamzat Chimaev, where we're trying to make a prediction based on few minutes, but there is still, 3 or 4 fights. So I'm weighing that together. I'm still going to land on the plus money with Blaydes. I like reliable wrestlers. He's proven himself, but it's not a huge play here. I do want to back off a little bit. There's some uncertainty. And at the end of this fight, we will know if Aspinall is truly a title contender.
And very quickly, you're talking to Reed Kuhn, of course. You can follow him as I do at Fightnomics, the author of a book of the same name, Fightnomics. Reed, when I see the total here, and I don't know if you've been able to run the models yet on this, and we're seeing here DraftKings, it's plus $1.50 if this fight goes over 3.5 rounds. My proclivity is, to your point, that the wrestling of Blaydes will be good enough to maybe extend Aspinall to waters he hasn't been in before. Do you see it that way going with the data here, or is there any support to the under in this fight?
So it's kind of anecdotal here because we're following the scenario. The scenario that I envision is Blaydes taking it down early and often, lying in ground control. He's been very good at maintaining that position and working in enough ground and pound to stay busy. Again, the crowd is a factor here. But the over is basically a play on Blaydes because he's not necessarily going to finish you right out of the gates. Eventually, yes, if he grinds this out, I don't know if Aspinall is going to be able to carry that weight for 25 minutes without giving up his back or getting hit with some elbows. Now, I don't play over-unders on heavyweights, so I will caveat that. This is not an official pick, but I do think if you are a believer in Blaydes and you think this is going to be a wrestling match, 3.5 at plus money is interesting. Maybe go for 2.5 at something even. Go more conservative and be willing to lay a little juice. Yeah,
I'm right there with you. And again, even here at Circuit Sportsbook, we're seeing now 2.5. You can still get plus money there, but at DraftKings plus $1.50 to over the 3.5 mark there. I do want to get to the return of Alexander Gustafsson, of course, one of the best light heavyweights a decade ago, and here we are now in 2022, and he's making his return back to this division. How do you handicap that with the time away? He had moved to heavyweight. That did not go well. And now he's almost a $2 betting underdog here against Krylov. Is that number to you enticing enough to back Gus off the layoff?
It's tempting, just from what I know of Gus, and I know his manager. I'm usually sending him information about this fighter in particular. It's tough though. A 2-year layoff is a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and yes, he had enough sample size. He also flirted with heavyweight. That muddies the waters a little bit. If we ignore all of that and just go by the numbers, we like Krylov here. I'm willing to lay even 2-1 for him, and still maybe I'm going to throw him into parlays. But the uncertainty pulls me back a little bit because weight class switching, time away from the sport, those are all uncertainties that we do not account for in the models. And therefore, I just have to sometimes back off and just say this is not as confident as it shows up on paper.
Yeah, I think it's a very astute observation there because, again, normally time does not work to the guy that lays off 2 years and comes back to this sport against somebody like Krylov. So you can understand why Krylov is the betting favorite there. We mentioned the crowd. We know it's going to be raucous, certainly in the main event. When Paddy Pimblett fights, it's going to be crazy. Also for Molly McCann, Meatball is going to be back in there. This number has ballooned as the week's gone on, and now we're seeing north of 420 up to minus 450 in her fight against Hannah Goldy here. Any chance for the dog, or do you think this fight, even though it's ballooned, is there any value left in the Meatball?
This is one of them where you line up the performance metrics and it's just advantages all day for Molly McCann. So I was one of those people who looked at the line when it was minus 225 a week ago and thought, wow, this is a no-brainer. I'm going to throw her into parlays. But here we are 1 week later and it has ballooned. So I am not the only one. This is not a controversial pick. No, I'm all over Molly McCann on this one. She has superior striking metrics all up and down, offensively, defensively. Who knows if this will go to the ground? Probably not. Goldy hasn't really been successful in taking people there. And McCann is going to go nonstop for 3 rounds. She is still going to be throwing spinning stuff into the 3rd round. So you have no idea what is coming. So I love McCann here. I don't know if she's going to get a finish or a decision, but I really do like the stats.
I want to look at Klein against Jones here, and Mason Jones right now is almost a $4 betting favorite here. What do you make of this matchup, too? Because normally we don't like to play some of these big favorites, but when you look at the numbers like you just did with Meatball McCann, sometimes they're just too good to pass up.
Yeah, this is interesting. I think we have a stronger opinion that this goes over than we do necessarily that Mason Jones is the next big thing. But you do have some interesting weight class issues here. So you have Jones that was competing at welterweight coming down. You have Klein that was at featherweight and coming up. They're meeting in the middle. Usually that confers a pretty big size advantage. And yes, Jones will be the bigger fighter, probably noticeably. I think you're 3 inches higher and taller and a few inches longer. So I think he's going to be the bigger guy here. His numbers are not outstanding. He's definitely going to be the more likely fighter to take this to the ground. And so I think that's why we're leaning over here, that Jones is maybe going to turn this into a wrestling match, because Klein does have good striking. His head strike accuracy at 42% is quite good in his UFC debut. And I remember this because he was the first Slovakian fighter to get a win in the UFC. Mm-hmm. I have someone in my house from that country. So we were celebrating here. But Klein has some head kicks. He has good striking. But I don't know if he's going to be able to withstand an onslaught on the ground. So I see Mason here as a deserved favorite. I think he's going to grind this out.
Got about 90 seconds left here with Reed Kuhn. Let's talk about Mark Diakise against Hadzovic here, because when you look at this fight as well, Hadzovic, Demir is about a plus 310 betting favorite. As this number is ballooned in the way of Diakise, he's minus 380. But I think you might find a better value here in the rounds instead of maybe playing the side.
Yeah, this is another one. Sometimes I look at these outputs and I'm like, why do the numbers skew so strongly for one guy? I was on Diakise early when his betting line was not so aggressive. I'm still backing him now. I believe he is the deserved favorite, and a lot has to do with pace. He's just a much busier and much more controlling fighter, and judges do respond to that. And if he's there getting the hometown crowd, or at least the local support, that could fuel him. But yes, I'm also leaning towards decision. Neither one of these guys is a pure knockout artist or a submission ace. They have lost by finish before. They don't tend to win that way. So I think we do have 2 guys who are used to just point striking and fighting that way, and yet one of them is way busier than the other one. So I'm hoping that Diakise just sort of wins the rounds, outpoints his opponent, and stays out of trouble on the ground.
All right, let me put you on the spot in 30 seconds. Jack Hermansson, Chris Curtis in the co-main event. What are the numbers shown there? Any lean either way?
Yeah, actually, the sample size isn't quite there yet. Curtis just met our criteria too recently. But I will say Paul Craig is an interesting upset call.
Ooh.
I do like that one on the main card. You've got a Scottish guy who is just destroying people on the mat and just physically destroying people, whether it's their arms, they're doing chokes. I like upset here. You're going to get him at plus money and maybe even a finish by submission.
Love that call, Reed. Really appreciate it as well. Want to thank Lou, Jordan, and Kevin for joining us. Enjoy the fights, everybody. We'll see you next week right here. First Strike on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network.